All right, there we go. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Isolated Literary Society presents Daily Austen with me, Sarah Shay. We will be reading chapter 13 and 14 today, probably. I've just been mostly doing 2 chapters a day, so I'm kind of assuming that's how it'll go today. Hope everybody had a good weekend. And let's get started. Chapter 13. Yeah. I told myself last week I should start doing like some vocal warm-ups before. Just some red leather, yellow leather. I love New York. I need New York. I need unique New York. That kind of stuff.
I've never heard that one before.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
Pepper's.
I forgot to, so here we go anyway. Pepper's ready.
Yes, he's listening intently.
Chapter 13. There could hardly be a happier creature in the world than Mrs. John Knightley in this short visit to Hartfield, going about every morning among her old acquaintance with her 5 children, and talking over what she had done every evening with her father and sister. She had nothing to wish otherwise, but the days did not pass so swiftly. It was a delightful visit, perfect in being much too short. In general, their evenings were less engaged with friends than their mornings, but one complete dinner engagement, and out of the house too, there was no avoiding, though at Christmas. Mr. Weston would take no denial. They must all dine at Randall's one day. Even Mr. Woodhouse was persuaded to think it a possible thing in preference to a division of the party. How they were all to be conveyed, he would have made a difficulty if he could, but as his son and daughter's carriage and horses were actually at Hartfield, he was not able to make more than a simple question on that head. It hardly amounted to a doubt, nor did it occupy Emma long to convince him that they might, in one of the carriages, find room for Harriet also. Harriet, Mr. Elton, and Mr. Knightley, their own especial set, were the only persons invited to meet them. The hours were to be early as well as the numbers few, Mr. Woodhouse's habits and inclination being consulted in everything. The evening before this great event, for it was a very great event that Mr. Woodhouse should dine out on the 24th of December, had been spent by Harriet at Hartfield, and she had gone home so much indisposed with a cold that, but for her own earnest wish of being nursed by Mrs. Goddard, Emma could not have allowed her to leave the house. Emma called on her the next day, and found her doom already signed with regard to Randall's. She was very feverish and had a bad sore throat. Mrs. Goddard was full of care and affection. Mr. Perry was talked of, and Harriet herself was too ill and low to resist the authority which excluded her from this delightful engagement, though she could not speak of her loss without many tears. Emma sat with her as long as she could, to attend her in Mrs. Goddard's unavoidable absences, and raised her spirits by representing how much Mr. Elton's would be depressed when he knew her state, and left her at last tolerably comfortable in the sweet dependence of his having a most comfortless visit, and all their missing her very much. She had not advanced many yards from Mrs. Goddard's door when she was met by Mr. Elton himself, evidently coming towards it, and as they walked on slowly together in conversation about the invalid, of whom he, on the rumor of considerable illness, had been going to inquire, that he might carry some report of her to Hartfield, they were overtaken by Mr. John Knightley returning from the daily visit to Donwell, with his 2 eldest boys, whose healthy, glowing faces showed all the benefit of a country run, and seemed to ensure a quick despatch of the roast mutton and rice pudding they were hastening home for. They joined company and proceeded together. Emma was just describing the nature of her friend's complaint. A throat very much inflamed, with a great deal of heat about her, a quick, low pulse, etc., and she was sorry to find from Mrs. Goddard that Harriet was liable to very bad sore throats, and had often alarmed her with them. Mr. Elton looked all alarm on the occasion, as he exclaimed, "A sore throat! I hope not infectious. I hope not of a putrid, infectious sort. Has Perry seen her? Indeed, you should take care of yourself as well as your friend. Let me entreat you to run no risks. Why does not Perry see her?" Emma, who was not really at all frightened herself, tranquilized this excess of apprehension by assurances of Mrs. Goddard's experience and care. But as there must still remain a degree of uneasiness which she could not wish to reason away, which she would rather feel and assist than not, she added soon afterwards, as if quite on another subject. It is so cold, so very cold, and looks and feels so very much like snow, that if it were to any other place or with any other party, I should really try not to go out today, and dissuade my father from venturing. But as he has made up his mind, and does not seem to feel the cold himself, seems unlikely, I do not like to interfere, as I know it would be so great a disappointment to Mr. and Mrs. Weston. But upon my word, Mr. Elton, in your case I should certainly excuse myself. You appear to me a little hoarse already, and when you consider what demand of voice and what fatigues tomorrow will bring, I think it would be no more than common prudence to stay at home and take care of yourself tonight. Mr. Elton looked as if he did not very well know what answer to make, which was exactly the case, for though very much gratified by the kind care of such a fair lady, and not liking to resist any advice of hers, he had not really the least inclination to give up the visit. But Emma, too eager and busy in her own previous conceptions and views to hear him impartially, or see him with clear vision, was very well satisfied with his muttering acknowledgment of its being very cold, certainly very cold, and walked on, rejoicing in having extricated himself from Randalls, and securing him the power of sending to inquire after Harriet every hour of the evening. You do quite right, said she. We will make your apologies to Mr. and Mrs. Weston. But hardly had she so spoken that she found her brother was civilly offering a seat in his carriage, if the weather were Mr. Elton's only objection, and Mr. Elton actually accepting the offer with much prompt satisfaction. It was a done thing. Mr. Elton was to go, and never had his broad, handsome face expressed more pleasure than at this moment. Never had his smile been stronger, nor his eyes more exulting than when he next looked at her. Well, she said to herself, this is most strange. After I had gotten him off so well, to choose to go into company and leave Harriet ill behind. Most strange indeed. But there is, I believe, in many men, especially single men, such an inclination, such a passion for dining out. A dinner engagement is so high in the class of their pleasures, their employments, their dignities, almost their duties, that anything gives way to it. And this must be the case with Mr. Elton. She's really bending over backwards to justify his behavior right now. I love that even at this point, the book, like the narrator is at this point, even like she is ignoring the obvious.
Right,
yeah. A most valuable, amiable, pleasing young man, undoubtedly, and very much in love with Harriet. But still he cannot refuse an invitation. He must dine out whenever he is asked. What a strange thing love is. He can see ready wit in Harriet, but will not dine alone for her. Curious. Yes. Soon afterwards, Mr. Elton quitted them, and she could not but do him the justice of feeling that there was a great deal of sentiment in his manner of naming Harriet at parting, in the tone of his voice while assuring her that he should call at Mrs. Goddard's for news of her fair friend, the last thing before he prepared for the happiness of meeting her again, when he hoped to be able to give a better report, and he sighed and smiled himself off in a way that left the balance of approbation much in his favor. After a few minutes of entire silence between them, John Knightley began with, I never in my life saw a man more intent on being agreeable than Mr. Elton. It is downright labor to him where ladies are concerned. With men he can be rational and unaffected, but when he has ladies to please, every feature works. Mr. Elton's manners are not perfect, replied Emma, but where there is a wish to please, one ought to overlook, and one does overlook a great deal. Where a man does his best with only moderate powers, he will have the advantage over negligent superiority. There is such perfect good temper and goodwill in Mr. Elton as one cannot but value. Yes, said Mr. John Knightley presently, with some slyness. He seems to have a great deal of goodwill towards you. Me, she replied with a smile of astonishment. Are you imagining me to be Mr. Elton's object? Such an imagination has crossed me, I own, Emma. And if it has never occurred to you before, you may as well take it into consideration now. Mr. Elton in love with me, what an idea. I do not say it is so, but you will do well to consider whether it is so or not, and to regulate your behavior accordingly. I think your manners to him encouraging. I speak as a friend, Emma. You had better look about you and ascertain what you do and what you mean to do. I thank you, but I assure you you are quite mistaken. Mr. Elton and I are very good friends and nothing more. And she walked on, amusing herself in the consideration of the blunders which often arise from a partial knowledge of circumstances, of the mistakes which people of high pretensions to judgment are forever falling into. Literally just described herself. And not very well pleased with her brother for imagining her blind and ignorant and in want of counsel. He said no more. Little water break here. That's delightful. Mr. Woodhouse had so completely made up his mind to the visit that in spite of the increasing coldness, he seemed to have no idea of shrinking from it, and set forward at last most punctually with his eldest daughter in his own carriage, with less apparent consciousness of the weather than either of the others, too full of the wonder of his own going, and the pleasure it was to afford at Randall's to see that it was cold, and too well wrapped up to feel it. The cold, however, was severe, and by the time the second carriage was in motion, a few flakes of snow were finding their way down, and the sky had the appearance of being so overcharged as to want only a milder air to produce a very white world in a very short time. Emma soon saw that her companion was not in the happiest humor. The preparing and the going abroad in such weather, with the sacrifice of his children after dinner, were disagreeables at least, which Mr. John Knightley did not by any means like. He anticipated nothing in the visit that could be at all worth the purchase, and the whole of their drive to the vicarage was spent by him in expressing his discontent. A man, said he, must have a very good opinion of himself when he asks people to leave their own fireside and encounter such a day as this for the sake of coming to see him. He must think himself a most agreeable fellow. I could not do such a thing. This doesn't seem in character for John.
It seems very grumpy and
yeah, I mean, he is a little bit grumpy, I think, but like
Yeah.
this seems a little over the top. But
it does, yeah. I don't know. Everybody's out of character in this.
right,
in this
yeah,
scene.
actually, good point. Mr. Woodhouse is very out of character in this.
Yeah, I don't understand.
He must think himself a most agreeable fellow. I could not do such a thing. It is the greatest absurdity, actually snowing at this moment. The folly of not allowing people to be comfortable at home, and the folly of people's not staying comfortably at home when they can. If we were obliged to go out such an evening as this, by any call of duty or business, what a hardship we should deem it. And here we are, probably with rather thinner clothing than usual, setting forward voluntarily, without excuse, in defiance of the voice of nature, which tells man, in everything given to his view or his feelings, to stay at home himself and keep all under shelter that he can. Here we are, setting forward to spend 5 dull hours in another man's house, with nothing to say or to hear that was not said or heard yesterday, and may not be said and heard again tomorrow. Going in dismal weather to return probably in worse, 4 horses and 4 servants taken out for nothing but to convey 5 idle, shivering creatures into colder rooms and worse company than they might have had at home. Emma did not find herself equal to give the pleased assent, which no doubt he was in the habit of receiving, to emulate the "very true, my love," which must have been usually administered by his traveling companion. But she had resolution enough to refrain from making any answer at all. She could not be complying. She dreaded being quarrelsome. Her heroism reached only to silence. She allowed him to talk and arrange the glasses and wrap herself up without opening her lips. There's an exclamation point at the end of that. Without opening her lips. Can you imagine? Emma Woodhouse not stating her opinion. They arrived, the carriage turned, the step was let down, and Mr. Elton, spruce, black, and smiling, was with them instantly. Emma thought with pleasure of some change of subject. Mr. Elton was all obligation and cheerfulness. He was so cheerful in his civilities indeed, that she began to think he must have received a different account of Harriet than what had reached her. She had sent while dressing, and the answer had been, much the same, not better. My report from Mrs. Goddard's, said she presently, was not so pleasant as I had hoped. Not better was my answer. His face lengthened immediately, and his voice was a voice of sentiment as he answered, Oh, no, I am grieved to find I was on the point of telling you that when I called at Mrs. Goddard's door, which I did the very last thing before I returned to dress, I was told that Miss Smith was not better, by no means better, rather worse. Very much grieved and concerned. I had flattered myself that she must be better after such a cordial as I knew had been given in the morning. Emma smiled and answered, My visit was of use to the nervous part of her complaint, I hope, but not even I can charm away a sore throat. It is a most severe cold indeed. Mr. Perry has been with her, as you probably heard. Yes, I imagined. That is, I did not. He has been used to her in these complaints, and I hope tomorrow will bring us both a more comfortable report. It is impossible not to feel uneasiness. Such a sad loss to our party today. Dreadful. Exactly so indeed. She will be missed every moment. This was very proper. The sigh which accompanied it was really estimable, but it should have lasted longer. Emma was rather in dismay when only half a minute afterwards he began to speak of other things, and in a voice of the greatest alacrity and enjoyment. Curious. What an excellent device, said he, the use of a sheepskin for carriages. How very comfortable they make it. Impossible to feel cold with such precautions. The contrivances of modern days, indeed, have rendered a gentleman's carriage perfectly complete. But one is so fenced and guarded from the weather that not a breath of air can find its way unpermitted. Weather becomes absolutely of no consequence. It is a very cold afternoon, but in this carriage we know nothing of the matter. Ha! It snows a little, I see. Yes, said Mr. John Knightley, and I think we shall have a good deal of it. Christmas weather, observed Mr. Elton, quite seasonable, and extremely fortunate we may think ourselves that it did not begin yesterday, and prevent this day's party, which it might very possibly have done, for Mr. Woodhouse would hardly have ventured had there been much snow on the ground. But now it is of no consequence. There is quite the season, indeed, for friendly meetings. At Christmas, everybody invites their friends about them, and people think little of even the worst weather. I was snowed up at a friend's house once for a week. Nothing could be pleasanter. I went for only one night, and could not get away till that very day se'nnight. Mr. John Knightley looked as if he did not comprehend the pleasure, but only said coolly, I cannot wish to be snowed up a week at Randall's. At another time, Emma might have been amused, but she was too much astonished now at Mr. Elton's spirits for other feelings. Harriet seemed quite forgotten in the expectation of a pleasant party. We are sure of excellent fires, continued he, and everything in the greatest comfort. Charming people, Mr. and Mrs. Weston. Mrs. Weston, indeed, is much beyond praise, and he is exactly what one values. So hospitable, and so fond of society. It will be a small party, but where small parties are select, they are perhaps the most agreeable of any. Mr. Weston's dining room does not accommodate more than 10 comfortably, and for my part, I would rather, under such circumstances, fall short by 2 than exceed by 2. I think you will agree with me, turning with a soft air to Emma. I think I shall certainly have your approbation, though Mr. Knightley, perhaps, from being used to the large parties of London, may not quite enter into our feelings. I know nothing of the large parties of London, sir. I never dine with anybody.
Shocking.
Indeed, in a tone of wonder and pity. I had no idea that the law had been such enjoyment, replied John Knightley as they passed through the sweep gate, will be to find myself safe at Hartfield again. He's not really painted as being this disagreeable prior to this scene. He's a little grumpy
really,
and a little quiet and reserved, but this is almost openly hostile.
Yeah.
All right. Oh, I have a little stretch.
There you go.
Everybody maybe do a little stretch if you feel it necessary. Do you like my sweater? I decided I felt like dressing up for this stream. So
I like it.
I'm wearing one of my favorite sweaters, even though it has to be hand washed. I'm just wearing it just for you guys. That's it. So it's such a lovely green. It's very soft.
Oh, nice.
Very soft. All right. Everyone appreciate my sweater? We're done? Good. I'm going to show you the illustration that comes next before I start reading the next chapter. This is presumably Emma and John Knightley and Mr. Elton entering the Weston's drawing room. The way they draw Mr. Elton in this...
yeah, I was going to say, I'm guessing the one with ridiculous. The floppy hair.
Yeah, he's supposed to be really handsome, though. Like, they make a big deal about the fact that he's quite handsome.
Yeah.
It's not his looks that are the problem.
Right.
And that they make him look ridiculous in these illustrations. I think they just wanted, it's hard maybe to make all the gentlemen look appreciably different.
Yeah.
And they wanted him to be recognizable in the drawings.
Possibly.
So they made him look the way he behaves. Who knows?
Maybe they were going for like a foppish kind of look, but on the assumption that that would have been acceptable to ladies or something like that.
Who knows? Who knows? All right. Let us continue on to chapter 14. Some change of countenance was necessary for each. Real quickly before I start, I was having some issues with GarageBand before. I just wanted to check it, make sure it was still going smoothly. And it is. Watch me never actually do anything with this audio. I'd better. It's been so much trouble recording it. All right. Some change of countenance was necessary for each gentleman as they walked into Mrs. Weston's drawing room. Mr. Elton must compose his joyous looks, and Mr. John Knightley disperse his ill humor. Mr. Elton must smile less, and Mr. John Knightley more, to fit them for the place. Emma only might be as nature prompted, and show herself just as happy as she was. To her, it was real enjoyment to be with the Westons. Mr. Weston was a great favorite, and there was not a creature in the world to whom she spoke with such unreserve as to his wife. Not anyone to whom she related with such conviction of being listened to and understood, of being always interesting and always intelligible. The little affairs, arrangements, perplexities, and pleasures of her father and herself. She could tell nothing of Hartfield in which Mrs. Weston had not a lively concern, and half an hour's uninterrupted communication of all those little matters on which the daily happiness of private life depends was one of the first gratifications of each. This was not a pleasure which perhaps the whole day's visit might afford, which certainly did not belong to the present half hour, but the very sight of Mrs. Weston, her smile, her touch, her voice, was grateful to Emma, and she determined to think as little as possible of Mr. Elton's oddities, or of anything else unpleasant, and enjoy all that was enjoyable to the utmost. The misfortune of Harriet's cold had been pretty well gone through before her arrival. Mr. Woodhouse had been safely seated long enough to give the history of it, besides all the history of his own and Isabella's coming, and Emma's being to follow, and had, indeed, just got to the end of his satisfaction that James should come and see his daughter, when the others appeared, and Mrs. Weston, who had been almost wholly engrossed by her attentions to him, was able to turn away and welcome her dear Emma. Emma's project of forgetting Mr. Elton for a while made her rather sorry to find, when they had all taken their places, that he was close to her. The difficulty was great of driving his strange insensibility towards Harriet from her mind, while he not only sat at her elbow, but was continually obtruding his happy countenance on her notice, and solicitously addressing her upon every concern. Instead of forgetting him, his behavior was such that she could not avoid the internal question of, can it really be as my brother imagined? Can it be possible for this man to be beginning to transfer his affections from Harriet to me? Absurd and insufferable. Yeah, even in her first starting to go, oh, he might actually like me. Yeah. She still thinks that he did like Harriet. She's still not able to go, oh, I see everything clearly now.
Yeah.
Absurd and insufferable. Yet he would be so anxious for her being perfectly warm, would be so interested about her father, and so delighted with Mrs. Weston, and at last would begin admiring her drawings with so much zeal and so little knowledge, it seemed terribly like a would-be lover, and made it some effort for her to preserve her good manners. For her own sake she could not be rude, and for Harriet's, in the hope that all would turn out right, she was even positively civil. But it was an effort, especially as something was going on amongst the others, in the most overpowering period of Mr. Elton's nonsense, which she particularly wished to listen to. She heard enough to know that Mr. Weston was giving some information about his son. She heard the words, my son, and Frank, and my son, repeated several times over, and from a few other half-syllables, very much suspected he was announcing an early visit from his son. And before she could quiet Mr. Elton, the subject was so completely past that any reviving question from her would have been awkward. Dude, that is so real. Have you ever been in a group conversation? You're in the middle of talking to someone and you hear someone at the other end of the table mention something you really want to talk about.
Yeah.
But by the time you extricate yourself from the person you're talking to, it's like the conversation's moved on. You can't get there. I always used to feel when I was younger, anytime I was with a group of people and they were seated like at dinner, I was always seated next to the person I least wanted to talk to and like at the boring end of the table. There was always a much more exciting end of the table that I wanted to be at.
Right, yeah.
And a few times when I tried to force myself sitting at the interesting end of the table, it like backfired.
Yeah.
I'm talking like teenagers, like groups of people going to Denny's, like stuff like that. Just always.
That's why I don't like large parties at long tables.
Yeah,
it's just,
because I realized as I got older that almost everybody feels that way.
Yeah.
Like everybody feels like they wish that the table had been dispersed differently. At least everybody at the boring end of the table does.
Right, yeah. Definitely.
Oh, anyway.
Yeah.
All right.
It is true.
Large parties are so tedious that way. I should never wish to eat with anyone. All right. Oh, where was I?
See nothing of London society.
I dined with no one. That sounded almost like a declaration.
I am a misanthrope, in case you haven't picked up on it.
All right, there we are. Now it so happened that, in spite of Emma's resolution of never marrying, there was something in the name, in the idea of Mr. Frank Churchill, which always interested her. She had frequently thought, especially since his father's marriage to Miss Taylor, that if she were to marry, he was the very person to suit her in age, character, and condition. He seemed, by this connection between the families, quite to belong to her. She could not but suppose it to be a match that everybody who knew them must think of. That Mr. and Mrs. Weston did think of it, she was very strongly persuaded, and though not meaning to be induced by him, or by anybody else, to give up a situation which she believed more replete with good than any she could change it for, she had a great curiosity to see him, a decided intention of finding him pleasant, of being liked by him to a certain degree, and a sort of pleasure in the idea of their being coupled in their friends' imaginations. With such sensations, Mr. Elton's civilities were dreadfully ill-timed, but she had the comfort of appearing very polite while feeling very cross. Is that comforting? And of thinking that the rest of the visit could not possibly pass without bringing forward the same information again, or the substance of it, from the open-hearted Mr. Weston. So it proved, for when happily released from Mr. Elton and seated by Mr. Weston at dinner, I thought they were already at dinner. What were they doing before?
I have no idea.
It's one of those things where, like, the structure of a party like that was just understood, that like there was this and then there was supper and then there was coffee and tea and then cards and then dinner, like that kind of whole structure.
Like I understood it in Pride and Prejudice when they described dinner as like the main meal of the day and then supper was later, because that's how I've always understood meals. I think
it must have been that
now
she meant
doing it differently.
Well, also, but maybe that's what they were doing. Maybe she was seated with him by Mr. Elton at supper.
That is possible, yeah.
Hold on, I want to see if they actually say, and I just wasn't paying attention.
Still seems like
because she was so trying so hard. It just says she was rather sorry to find when they had all taken their places that he was close to her. She doesn't say places at what. So I think it's just one of those times when you're just supposed to understand how society works, because she was writing for an audience of her peers.
Right.
So, anyway, it's one of those things. Oh, hello, Erin. Glad you made it today. All right.
It was their places in the charades.
All right.
Which we also don't understand.
So it proved. For, when happily released from Mr. Elton, and seated by Mr. Weston at dinner, he made use of the very first interval in the cares of hospitality, the very first leisure from the saddle of mutton, to say to her, "We want only 2 more to be just the right number. I should like to see 2 more here, your pretty friend, Miss Smith, and my son, and then I should say we were quite complete. I believe you did not hear me telling the others in the drawing-room," they were in the drawing-room, "that we are expecting Frank. I had a letter from him this morning, and he will be with us within a fortnight." Emma spoke with a very proper degree of pleasure, and fully assented to his proposition of Mr. Frank Churchill and Miss Smith making their party quite complete. "He has been wanting to come to us," continued Mr. Weston, "ever since September. Every letter has been full of it, but he cannot command his own time. He has those to please who must be pleased, and whom, between ourselves, are sometimes to be pleased only by a good many sacrifices." Okay. Oh, another weird sentence. He has those to please who must be pleased, and who, between ourselves, are sometimes to be pleased only by a good many sacrifices. Ill-placed comma in that sentence that made it confusing. Sorry, Jane Austen. Oh, how dare I call one of your commas ill-placed? Who am I?
Editorializing.
Yeah, but now I have no doubt of seeing him here about the second week of January. What a very great pleasure it will be to you, and Mrs. Weston, who is so anxious to be acquainted with him, that she must be almost as happy as yourself. Yes, she would be, but that she thinks that there will be another put-off. She does not depend upon his coming so much as I do, but she does not know the parties so well as I do. The case, you see, is, but this is quite between ourselves. I did not mention a syllable of this in the other room. There are secrets in all families, you know. The case is that a party of friends are invited to pay a visit at Enscombe in January, and that Frank's coming depends upon their being put off. If they are not put off, he cannot stir. But I know they will, because it is a family that a certain lady of some consequence. I am confident of seeing Frank here. I am as confident of seeing Frank here before the middle of January as I am of being here myself. But your good friend there, nodding towards the upper end of the table, has so few vagaries herself, and has been so little used to them in Hartfield, that she cannot calculate on their effects, as I have been long in the practice of doing. I think by your good friend there, he means his wife.
Yes.
Oh, the upper end of the table. They would be at either end of the table, I guess.
That does make sense, yeah.
Another one of those things we're just supposed to understand. Oh no, GarageBand is being a dick again. Uh-oh. Maybe I should just stop. Should I just stop recording this thing? I've been trying to record this so I can maybe, I don't know, put it on Patreon or something, but it's so much trouble. I'm going to go back just a little bit in case we lost any. Oh, when I was talking for a moment, maybe you just lost me talking about where Mrs. Weston would be seated. Anyway, yes. I am as confident of seeing Frank here before the middle of January as I am of being here myself. But your good friend there, nodding towards the upper end of the table, has so few vagaries herself, and has been so little used to them at Hartfield, that she cannot calculate on their effects, as I have been long in the practice of doing. I am sorry that there should be anything like doubt in the case, replied Emma, but I am disposed to side with you, Mr. Weston. If you think he will come, I shall think so too, for you know Enscombe. Yes, I have some right to that knowledge, though I have never been at the place in my life. She is an odd woman, but I never allow myself to speak ill of her on Frank's account, for I do believe her to be very fond of him. I used to think her not capable of being fond of anybody except herself, but she has always been kind to him, in her way, allowing for little whims and caprices, and expecting everything to be as she likes. And it is no small credit, in my opinion, to him that he should excite such an affection, for though I would not say it to anybody else but your sister-in-law, Emma liked the subject so well that she began upon it to Mrs. Weston very soon after their moving into the drawing-room, wishing her joy, yet observing that she knew the first meeting must be rather alarming. Mrs. Weston agreed to it, but added that she should be very glad to be secure of undergoing the anxiety of a first meeting at the time talked of. For I cannot depend upon his coming. I cannot be so sanguine as Mr. Weston. I am very much afraid that it will all end in nothing. Mr. Weston, I dare say, has been telling you exactly how the matter stands? Yes, it seems to depend upon nothing but the ill humor of Mrs. Churchill, which I imagine to be the most certain thing in the world. My Emma, replied Mrs. Weston, smiling, what is the certainty of caprice? Then turning to Isabella, who had not been attending before, you must know, my dear Mrs. Knightley, that we are by no means so sure of seeing Mr. Frank Churchill, in my opinion, as his father thinks. It depends entirely upon his aunt's spirits and pleasure, in short, upon her temper. To you, to my 2 daughters, I may venture on the truth. Mrs. Churchill rules at Enscombe, and is a very odd-tempered woman, and his coming now depends upon her being willing to spare him. Oh, Mrs. Churchill, everybody knows Mrs. Churchill, replied Isabella, and I am sure I never think of that poor young man without the greatest compassion. To be constantly living with an ill-tempered person must be dreadful. It is what we happily have never known anything of, but it must be a life of misery. What a blessing that she never had any children. Poor little creatures, how unhappy she would have made them.
Oh, boy.
Emma wished she had been alone with Mrs. Weston. She should then have heard more, Mrs. Weston would speak to her with a degree of unreserve which she would not hazard with Isabella, and she really believed would scarcely try to conceal anything relative to the Churchills from her, excepting those views on the young man of which her own imagination had already given her such instinctive knowledge. But at present there was nothing more to be said. Mr. Woodhouse very soon followed them into the drawing-room. To be sitting long after dinner was a confinement that he could not endure. Neither wine nor conversation was anything to him, and gladly did he move to those with whom he was always comfortable. While he talked to Isabella, however, Emma found an opportunity of saying, "And so you do not consider this visit from your son as by any means certain? I am sorry for it." Wait. Who's talking right now?
I thought it said
Emma, but
she's talking to Isabella?
No, it sounds like she says from your son. Oh, to Mrs. Weston. She's turning back to Mrs. Weston. Ugh. Her father comes over and talks to Isabella, which allows Emma to say to Mrs. Weston.
Right.
Okay. "And so you do not consider this visit from your son as by any means certain? I am sorry for it. The introduction must be unpleasant whenever it takes place, and the sooner it could be over, the better." "Yes, and every delay makes one apprehensive of other delays. Even in this family, the Braithwaites, even if this family, the Braithwaites, are put off, I am still afraid that some excuse may be found for disappointing us. I cannot bear to imagine any reluctance on his side, but I am sure there is a great wish on the Churchills to keep him to themselves. There is jealousy. They are jealous even of his regard of his father. In short, I can feel no dependence on his coming, and I wish Mr. Weston were less sanguine." "He ought to come," said Emma. "If he could stay only a couple days, he ought to come. A couple of days, he ought to come. And one can hardly conceive a young man's not having it in his power to do as much as that. A young woman, if she falls into bad hands, may be teased, and kept at a distance from those she wants to be with, but one cannot comprehend a young man's being under such restraint as not to be able to spend a week with his father if he... One ought to use the same caution, perhaps, in judging of the conduct of any one individual of any one family. But Enscombe, I believe. But she is so fond of the nephew. He is so very great a favourite. Now, according to my idea of Mrs. Churchill, it would be most natural that while she makes no sacrifice for the comfort of the husband, to whom she owes everything, while she exercises incessant caprice towards him, she should frequently be governed by the nephew, to whom she owes nothing at all. My dearest Emma, do not pretend with your sweet temper to understand a bad one, or to lay down rules for it. You must let it go its own way. I have no doubt of his having, at times, considerable influence, but it may be perfectly impossible for him to know beforehand when it will be." Emma listened, and then coolly said, "I shall not be satisfied until he comes." "He may have a great deal of influence on some points," continued Mrs. Weston, "and on others very little. But among those on which she is beyond his reach, it is but too likely, may be this very circumstance of his coming away from them to visit us." That sentence makes no sense. Jane, what are you doing? Okay, well, that concludes chapter 14. And that is a little bit short, but last time I decided, I'll just do one more chapter. I ended up going over an hour. And this one actually looks like rather a long chapter. 15. So we will save chapter 15 for tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in. I hope that you enjoyed it. Thanks to everyone watching this later. In case you somehow happened upon this and don't know what's going on, I'm reading Emma every day, Monday through Friday, at 6 p.m. Pacific, a couple chapters at a time. And on Sunday nights, I am currently doing live stream concerts, but I'm considering moving it around a little bit because I've recently found out that there are a number of people who would like to watch the live stream concerts who can't do Sunday nights. They have prior engagements. So I'm thinking about maybe switching it back and forth between Saturday and Sunday. I really want to have a set schedule that never moves, but I get that not one day can work for everybody. So we'll see. I might end up doing this week's concert on Saturday instead and changing it up. I will definitely make the decision by tomorrow, so there's plenty of notice for everyone. So keep coming back to this channel, I guess. I think if you're occasionally missing these due to forgetting that they're happening. So thanks again for watching. And on that note,